"Sir, you dropped this 12 years ago." The words landed softer than the jazz floating through the rooftop steakhouse, but somehow they cut deeper than anything Ethan Callaway had heard all night. The Billionaire CEO looked down at the folded white note resting beside his medium-rare ribeye, and for the first time in years, the color drained from his face. Around him, crystal glasses glimmered beneath gold chandelier light. Investors laughed over 18-year bourbon. A server passed carrying plates that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. But suddenly, none of it mattered. Ethan's fingers stopped halfway to his whiskey glass. The conversation around the private table slowed. One of the investors frowned. Another leaned back in confusion. Because men like Ethan Callaway did not freeze. They controlled rooms. They owned outcomes. They turned silence into pressure and pressure into profit. Yet now, under the amber glow of Manhattan's most exclusive steakhouse, he stared at a single handwritten sentence like it had reached inside his chest and touched something buried. Naomi Brooks stood beside the table in her black uniform, posture straight, expression calm. 26 years old. Dark skin glowing softly beneath the restaurant lights. Hair pulled back neatly. No jewelry except a cheap silver watch she'd worn for 3 years. To most guests inside Marlowe Prime, she was invisible. Just another black waitress carrying trays through a room full of wealthy people pretending not to notice her. But Naomi noticed everyone. She noticed wedding rings hidden before phone calls. She noticed who tipped generously and who snapped fingers instead of saying thank you. She noticed which billionaires smiled for cameras then insulted employees the second reporters walked away. And tonight, she noticed Ethan Callaway pretending he wasn't afraid. "Excuse me," Ethan finally said, his voice low and controlled, though the edge beneath it had started to crack. Naomi didn't blink. "Your steak, sir," she replied gently. Then she turned to leave. Ethan grabbed the edge of the note before it could slide from the table. His pulse pounded once. Hard. Investor Daniel Mercer chuckled awkwardly. "You know her?" he asked. Ethan ignored him completely. Because the handwriting on that paper wasn't random. It wasn't a prank. And it wasn't possible. He unfolded the note beneath the table, careful enough that nobody else could see. One sentence. That was all. But it was enough to drag him backward 12 years in less than a heartbeat. Chicago. Winter. A financial audit that disappeared overnight. A man blamed for numbers he didn't create. A signature buried in a second file no one was supposed to find. Ethan stared at the words again. Then slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi across the restaurant. She was already serving another table, calm as still water, asking an older couple if they wanted fresh pepper on their filet mignon. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just detonated something inside the most powerful man in the room. Ethan swallowed hard. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath cold April rain. Yellow taxis crawled through the streets below like streams of light. Inside Marlowe Prime, the pianist shifted into a slower song. Forks clinked against porcelain. Expensive laughter returned in nervous little waves. But Ethan could barely hear any of it now. Because for the first time in 12 years, the past had not only found him. It had walked straight up to his table wearing a waitress uniform and looked him directly in the eye. Ethan Callaway had spent most of his life mastering one thing above all else: control. Control over markets. Control over headlines. Control over fear. At 42 years old, the founder of Callaway Capital had built a reputation sharp enough to silence boardrooms with a single look. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Business rivals called him ruthless. Employees called him something else behind closed doors, though never loudly enough for him to hear. But tonight, sitting beneath the warm chandelier light of Marlowe Prime, Ethan could feel control slipping through his fingers one quiet second at a time. He folded the note once more and slid it into the inside pocket of his tailored navy suit. His jaw tightened. Across the table, Daniel Mercer kept talking about the merger like nothing had happened. If we close by Q3, the projections could clear another $600 million before Christmas, Daniel said, cutting into a 32-ounce porterhouse steak. Another investor laughed softly and raised his bourbon glass. To Callaway Capital owning half the Midwest by next summer. Glasses clinked. Smiles returned. But Ethan barely heard any of it. Because all he could see now was Naomi Brooks moving silently between tables with that same impossible calm. She carried a tray of drinks through the crowded dining room while the city skyline shimmered behind her through the rain-streaked windows. Her expression never changed. No fear. No hesitation. And somehow that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Ethan finally pushed back his chair. "Excuse me," he muttered. Daniel looked surprised. "Everything all right?" Ethan forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Business call." He walked away before anyone could ask another question. The hallway leading toward the private restrooms was quieter, dimmer, lined with black marble walls and gold sconces that cast soft light across the floor. Ethan loosened his tie slightly and pulled the note back out again. The handwriting was neat. Deliberate. Almost elegant. "I know what happened in Chicago. And I know who signed the second file." His stomach tightened all over again. 12 years. 12 years since anyone had mentioned Chicago to him directly. The scandal had disappeared before it ever reached national news. Buried beneath settlements, sealed records, and expensive lawyers. One man had taken the fall publicly. Marcus Brooks. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at the memory. Senior accountant. Quiet. Brilliant with numbers. The kind of employee executives rarely noticed until something went wrong. Marcus had insisted the reports were falsified. Claimed somebody altered the financial statements before federal auditors arrived. Nobody listened. By the end of the month, Marcus Brooks had lost his job, his reputation, and eventually everything else. Ethan remembered the final meeting vividly. Snow falling outside the office windows. Marcus sitting across the conference table with red eyes and shaking hands. "You know I did not do this," he had said quietly. Ethan remembered saying nothing. That silence had followed him for 12 years like a shadow. A soft sound interrupted the memory. Footsteps. Ethan looked up sharply. Naomi stood at the end of the hallway holding a silver tray against her hip. For a moment neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise faded into a distant hum behind them. Ethan studied her face more carefully now. The eyes. The cheekbones. Something suddenly clicked deep inside him like a lock turning open. "Brooks," he said slowly. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Yes, sir." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face all over again. "Marcus Brooks," he whispered. Naomi held his stare without blinking. "My father." The air between them turned painfully still. Somewhere behind the hallway walls, expensive laughter rolled across the restaurant again, followed by the soft clink of crystal against crystal. But inside that narrow strip of black marble and gold light, the world suddenly felt much smaller. Ethan stared at Naomi as if seeing a ghost that had stepped out of a locked room in his memory. Marcus Brooks. He had not spoken that name aloud in years. Not after the investigations disappeared. Not after the board forced everyone involved to sign silence agreements thicker than legal textbooks. Not after Callaway Capital buried Chicago beneath billions of dollars and newer headlines. Yet here stood Marcus Brooks's daughter wearing a pressed black waitress uniform and holding a silver tray like she belonged to a completely different story. Ethan swallowed carefully. "That is impossible," he said quietly. Naomi's expression never changed. "No, sir," she replied. "It is uncomfortable. There is a difference." Her calmness unsettled him more every second. Most people around Ethan either feared him, flattered him, or wanted something from him. Naomi did none of those things. She simply stood there beneath the warm hallway lights, patient and steady, like she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind and no longer needed emotion to carry it. Ethan glanced down the hallway instinctively, making sure no investors had followed him. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. Naomi tilted the tray slightly against her hip. "Interesting question," she said softly. "You never asked what my father wanted." The words landed hard. Ethan looked away first. Outside the rain-streaked windows nearby, Manhattan shimmered in silver and gold beneath the storm clouds. Taxis crawled through the streets 30 floors below while lightning flickered faintly over the Hudson River. Inside Marlowe Prime, the smell of butter, steak, and cigar smoke drifted through the air like nothing in the world had changed. But Ethan could feel old walls inside himself beginning to crack. "Your father made mistakes," he said finally, though even he heard how weak it sounded. Naomi nodded once. "That is what they told everyone." Ethan's jaw tightened. The reports were altered. "By who?" she asked gently. Silence. Ethan hated silence. In boardrooms, silence meant weakness. It meant hesitation. It meant somebody else was gaining leverage. Yet now he found himself trapped inside it, unable to force his way out. Naomi watched him carefully. "You remember him, do not you?" she asked. Ethan remembered more than he wanted to. Marcus Brooks arriving early every morning carrying cheap coffee in paper cups. Marcus staying late after everyone else left. Marcus nervously adjusting his tie during meetings because expensive rooms made him uncomfortable. A brilliant accountant from the south side of Chicago who believed honesty mattered more than power. Ethan remembered something else too. The night Marcus realized he had been chosen as the scapegoat. He had not yelled. He had not threatened lawsuits. He had simply looked tired. Deeply tired. "I have a daughter," Marcus had said quietly back then. "Please do not do this." Ethan closed his eyes briefly as the memory hit him like cold rain. Naomi noticed the reaction immediately. "I was 14 when he died," she said. Ethan opened his eyes sharply. Naomi's voice remained controlled, but now there was something heavier underneath it. Not rage. Not revenge. Grief polished smooth by time. "After the scandal," she continued, "nobody would hire him. We lost our apartment 3 months later. My mother worked double shifts at a nursing home until she got sick herself." Ethan felt something twist painfully in his chest. Naomi took one slow breath. "You know the worst part?" she asked. Ethan said nothing. "My father still believed you would eventually tell the truth." The pianist inside the restaurant shifted into another slow jazz melody while thunder rolled faintly outside the windows. Ethan suddenly realized he could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to him without fear. Naomi stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice. "That note was not a threat, Mr. Calloway." Ethan looked at her carefully. "Then what is it?" Naomi held his stare. "A chance." For a long moment, Ethan Calloway simply stared at her. A chance. The word echoed strangely inside his head because men like Ethan were used to buying chances, negotiating chances, manufacturing chances through money and influence. But this felt different. This felt frighteningly human. Naomi adjusted the silver tray slightly against her hip as a pair of wealthy guests passed through the hallway laughing loudly about stock prices and vacation homes in Aspen. Neither of them looked twice at her. Ethan noticed that now. The invisibility. The way people with money moved around service workers as if they were part of the furniture. 12 years ago, he had done the exact same thing to Marcus Brooks. Seen the work. Ignored the men. Why now? Ethan asked quietly. Naomi studied him for a second before answering. "Because tomorrow morning your company announces the merger with Westbridge Financial." Ethan's expression darkened immediately. "How do you know about that?" Naomi almost smiled. "Mr. Calloway, rich people say a lot around waitresses they think are invisible." The answer hit harder than he expected. Ethan suddenly remembered every careless conversation he had ever had around staff members without bothering to lower his voice. Every insult. Every dismissal. Every moment he assumed nobody important was listening. Naomi continued calmly. "Tomorrow you become more powerful than ever. Bigger headlines. Bigger interviews. Bigger speeches about leadership and integrity." Ethan folded his arms tightly. "You think this is blackmail?" Naomi shook her head immediately. "If I wanted money, I would have gone to the press weeks ago." Ethan looked at her carefully, trying to find anger in her face. Trying to find ambition. Something selfish. But Naomi Brooks stood there with the same quiet dignity she had carried all night. That unsettled him more than threats ever could. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked again. Naomi glanced toward the dining room where wealthy guests laughed beneath warm chandelier light while servers moved silently between tables carrying dry-aged steaks and expensive wine. "The truth," she said softly. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "You have no idea how complicated this is." Naomi's eyes sharpened slightly for the first time. "No, Mr. Calloway. I think I do." The hallway fell quiet again. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across Manhattan while rain tapped gently against the massive glass windows overlooking the city. Ethan loosened his tie another inch. Suddenly the custom Italian suit felt heavier than usual. Naomi lowered her voice. "My father kept copies of everything." Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" "Not enough to save himself back then," she said. "But enough to prove he was telling the truth." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Where are they?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the silence sit there between them long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then finally she said, "Safe." Ethan ran a hand across his jaw, frustration building beneath the surface now. "Do you understand what happens if those documents go public?" Naomi nodded once. "Do you?" The question landed hard because deep down Ethan already knew the answer. Federal investigations. Media storms. Investor panic. The collapse of reputations carefully polished over decades. Men at the top rarely feared the truth itself. They feared timing. And tonight, the timing was catastrophic. Naomi watched realization spread slowly across his face. "You could destroy everything I built," Ethan said quietly. Naomi's expression softened just slightly then, not with sympathy exactly, but something close to disappointment. "That is the strange part," she replied. "My father used to say the same thing about you." Ethan looked away immediately. The memory hit him again with brutal clarity now. Marcus Brooks sitting alone in that Chicago conference room while snow fell outside the windows. One man begging to be believed. Another man too ambitious to speak. Ethan suddenly felt older than 42. Tired in places success had never managed to fix. Naomi took one small step back toward the restaurant entrance. "You still have time," she said gently. Ethan looked at her. "Time for what?" Naomi held his gaze steadily. "To become a different man than the one my father died believing you were." Naomi walked back into the dining room with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, but now Ethan Calloway watched her differently. Not as background noise. Not as another server drifting between tables beneath warm chandelier light. For the first time since entering Marlowe Prime that night, Ethan saw her clearly. And somehow that made everything worse. The rooftop steakhouse glowed with wealth and performance. Wall Street executives laughed too loudly beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking rain-soaked Manhattan. Gold candlelight flickered against polished wine glasses. The scent of truffle butter and sizzling beef floated through the room while a pianist in the corner played soft jazz no one was truly listening to. Everything looked elegant. Untouchable. But Ethan suddenly understood how fragile powerful rooms really were. One truth. One document. One forgotten name. That was all it took. "There he is," Daniel Mercer called from the investor table as Ethan returned. "We thought you escaped through the kitchen." A few men laughed. Ethan forced a smile and slid back into his seat. His untouched steak sat cooling beneath the restaurant lights. The note still rested like dead weight inside his jacket pocket. Daniel swirled ice inside his bourbon glass. "So," he said casually, "Westbridge signs tomorrow morning and suddenly you become the most powerful man in finance under 50. Not bad for a guy from Pittsburgh." Another investor raised his glass. "To Ethan Calloway. The king of strategic timing." More laughter followed. Ethan usually enjoyed moments like this. Admiration. Control. Rooms full of wealthy men measuring success through him. But tonight every compliment sounded hollow. Across the restaurant, Naomi quietly refilled water glasses at another table without drawing attention to herself. Ethan noticed how carefully she listened while appearing not to listen at all. It struck him then that people like Naomi probably knew more secrets about the rich than journalists ever would. Wealthy people forgot themselves around invisible workers. They revealed affairs over dessert. Insider deals over whiskey. Cruel opinions between bites of expensive steak. And nobody noticed the servers standing 3 feet away collecting every word. "You all right?" Daniel asked suddenly. Ethan blinked. "Fine. You look pale." Ethan reached for his bourbon and took a slow sip. The burn barely registered. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "This merger nervousness or something else?" Ethan almost laughed at the irony. Daniel thought the pressure came from tomorrow's financial announcement. He had no idea the real danger was carrying trays through the dining room in a black apron. One of the younger investors glanced toward Naomi as she passed nearby. "Staff here is incredible," he said casually. "Especially that waitress. She remembers everybody's drink order without writing anything down." Another man smirked. "Probably trained that way. Some people are born for service." Ethan's eyes lifted immediately toward Naomi. She heard the comment. He could tell by the tiny pause in her movement. But she kept walking. Calm. Professional. Dignified. No reaction at all. Something about that silence hit Ethan harder than outrage would have. 12 years ago Marcus Brooks had reacted the same way during meetings. Calm voice. Straight posture. Quiet dignity while richer men spoke over him like he was furniture. Ethan suddenly realized how many people he had mistaken for weak simply because they chose restraint instead of noise. Daniel kept talking about projections and market expansion, but Ethan barely listened anymore. His attention drifted repeatedly toward Naomi. Toward the woman carrying her father's grief through a crowded luxury restaurant without letting it poison her. That unsettled him deeply because Ethan knew what bitterness looked like. He had built entire industries around it. But Naomi Brooks did not seem driven by revenge. She seemed driven by disappointment. And somehow disappointment felt far more dangerous. Then Ethan noticed something else. Near the hostess stand, Naomi quietly slipped a small manila envelope beneath her order book before continuing toward the kitchen. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. Nobody else at the table noticed it. But Ethan did. His pulse slowed instantly. Because powerful men develop instincts for danger. And every instinct inside him suddenly whispered the exact same thing. The documents were here. Ethan tried to keep his expression neutral, but his mind had already locked onto the manila envelope beneath Naomi's order book like a spotlight in darkness. The restaurant noise around him suddenly felt distant and distorted, as if the entire rooftop dining room had slipped underwater. Daniel Mercer was still talking about acquisition numbers. Another investor was laughing about private jets and summer homes in the Hamptons. Waiters moved gracefully between tables balancing $1,000 bottles of wine beneath warm chandelier light. But Ethan could no longer focus on any of it. Because somewhere inside this glittering Manhattan steakhouse sat evidence powerful enough to destroy everything he had spent 20 years building. Naomi crossed the dining room calmly, stopping beside an elderly couple near the windows. Ethan watched her smile politely while describing dessert options. Peach cobbler. Vanilla bean cheesecake. Flourless chocolate cake. Her voice carried the same calm rhythm as before, steady enough to make it seem impossible that she had just shaken one of the most powerful men on Wall Street without raising her tone once. Ethan reached for his whiskey again and found his hand trembling slightly. He lowered the glass immediately. Across the table, Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly, "something is definitely wrong." Ethan forced another thin smile. "Long week. You have handled congressional investigations with less tension than this." A few men chuckled softly, but Ethan barely heard them. His attention remained fixed on the hostess stand where the envelope disappeared beneath menus and reservation books. He tried to think strategically now. That was what Ethan Callaway had always done best. Analyze risk. Neutralize threats. Stay ahead of damage before damage became public. But this situation refused to fit neatly into the systems he trusted. Because Naomi Brooks was not behaving like someone seeking leverage. She had not demanded money. She had not threatened headlines. She had not secretly recorded him or leaked anything online. Instead, she had offered him something infinitely more dangerous. Conscience. Ethan hated how deeply that unsettled him. One of the younger investors suddenly glanced toward Naomi again. "She really is impressive," he said casually. "Most people working these jobs look exhausted by 10 o'clock. Another man smirked without looking up from his steak. "That is because most people in service know their place." Ethan's eyes lifted sharply. The words hung in the air heavier than the speaker intended. Naomi heard them again. Ethan saw the tiny flicker in her eyes this time before she lowered her gaze politely and continued working. No anger. No embarrassment. Just quiet endurance polished by years of repetition. Ethan suddenly remembered Marcus Brooks standing silently at the back of conference rooms while executives talked around him instead of to him. Smart enough to fix problems nobody else understood. Invisible enough that nobody bothered protecting him when blame became convenient. The realization tightened painfully in Ethan's chest. This entire system had always depended on certain people remaining unseen. Then his phone vibrated against the table. Ethan looked down immediately. A message from Westbridge Financial's chairman flashed across the screen. "Looking forward to tomorrow. This changes everything." Ethan stared at the words longer than necessary. Changes everything. The irony almost made him laugh. Across the dining room, Naomi returned briefly to the hostess stand. Smoothly, without attracting attention, she picked up the manila envelope again and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. Then she looked directly at him from across the crowded restaurant. Not aggressively. Not triumphantly. Calmly. As if she already knew exactly what decision he was wrestling with inside his own head. The pianist shifted into a slower melody while rain streaked softly down the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. Candlelight flickered across polished marble floors. Wealthy guests kept laughing. Business deals kept unfolding. But Ethan Callaway suddenly understood something terrifying. The most important negotiation of his life was no longer happening at the investor table. It was happening between a billionaire who built his empire on silence and a black waitress who had finally decided she was done carrying somebody else's shame. The check arrived at the investor table just after 10:30, tucked neatly inside a black leather folder embossed with gold lettering. Normally Ethan Callaway would have signed it without looking. Men like him rarely noticed prices anymore. But tonight his attention drifted nowhere except toward Naomi Brooks. She moved through Marlowe Prime with quiet precision while Manhattan glowed silver beneath the rain outside. Every few minutes Ethan caught himself watching her again. Refilling water glasses. Clearing empty plates. Smiling politely at guests who barely acknowledged her existence. Yet somehow she remained the only person in the restaurant who felt completely in control. Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. "Tomorrow morning changes Wall Street forever," he announced proudly. "By noon every financial network in America will have Ethan's face on television." Several investors lifted their glasses in agreement. One man laughed loudly. "You are about to become untouchable." Ethan almost flinched at the word. Untouchable. 12 years ago he probably would have believed it too. Success had a dangerous way of convincing powerful people that consequences belonged to somebody else. But tonight, every polished surface inside Marlowe Prime reflected something Ethan had spent years trying not to see. Himself. The younger investor who had made the comment about service workers earlier waved Naomi over casually. "Miss, can we get another bottle of the Cabernet?" Naomi nodded politely. "Of course, sir." The man barely looked at her before returning to his conversation about private equity and vacation properties. Ethan noticed something then that he had somehow missed for years. Naomi listened carefully to every person she served, even the rude ones. Not because she was submissive. Because she understood people. Wealthy men revealed themselves most clearly when they believed nobody important was paying attention. Daniel loosened his tie and smirked toward Ethan. "You know what your problem is tonight?" Ethan looked at him tiredly. "What?" "You are thinking too much." A few men chuckled. "That is because success finally caught up to him," another investor joked. "Tomorrow he becomes king." Ethan forced a faint smile, but the words landed hollow inside him. King. Powerful. Untouchable. The entire room spoke about power like it was permanent. Yet one quiet waitress carrying a manila envelope had managed to unravel his confidence in less than an hour. Naomi returned with the wine bottle balanced carefully against her arm. As she poured deep red Cabernet into crystal glasses, Daniel smiled at her casually. "Busy night?" "Yes, sir," Naomi replied softly. "You handling all these billionaires okay?" A few men laughed at the joke. Naomi smiled politely. "I have learned wealthy people are usually easier to manage than they think." The table laughed louder this time, assuming it was harmless humor. But Ethan heard something else beneath the sentence. "Truth." Daniel raised his glass approvingly. "Smart answer." Naomi nodded once and turned to leave. Then Ethan spoke before he could stop himself. "Naomi." The entire table went quiet for a second. Investors glanced between them curiously. Naomi stopped and faced him calmly. Ethan felt every eye at the table settle onto him now. The CEO, who usually ignored staff, suddenly knew a waitress by name. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. Ethan hesitated. He had spent 2 decades mastering public confidence, but this moment felt strangely difficult. Finally he asked quietly, "Do you have a minute?" Naomi studied him carefully before answering. "My shift ends in 20 minutes. Ethan nodded once. "I will wait." The word surprised even him. Because Ethan Calloway did not wait for people. Ever. Yet now he sat silently beneath the chandelier light while investors exchanged confused looks around him. Naomi gave a small professional nod and disappeared toward the kitchen doors again. Daniel leaned closer immediately. "Okay," he whispered, "what exactly is going on here?" Ethan looked toward the kitchen entrance where Naomi vanished from sight. Rain rolled softly down the massive windows behind him while thunder murmured somewhere above Manhattan. Then Ethan answered with a truth he barely understood himself. "I think," he said quietly, "I just met the only honest person in this building." By 11 o'clock the crowd inside Marlowe Prime had begun to thin, but the restaurant still glowed with the polished illusion of wealth. Investors drifted toward the elevators laughing into expensive phones. Waiters cleared half-empty wine glasses beneath warm chandelier light. Outside the massive windows, Manhattan shimmered under cold rain while yellow taxis painted streaks of gold across the streets below. Ethan Calloway remained seated alone at the private table long after Daniel Mercer and the others finally left. His untouched steak had gone cold nearly an hour ago. A billionaire surrounded by luxury, waiting in silence for a waitress finishing her shift. The irony was almost painful. Ethan loosened his tie completely now, exhaustion settling visibly across his face. For years he had believed success erased the past. That was the dangerous thing about power. It convinced people they could outgrow accountability. But tonight every polished surface inside the restaurant seemed to reflect the same uncomfortable truth back at him. "You knew. And you stayed silent anyway." The kitchen doors finally swung open softly. Naomi stepped out wearing a dark wool coat over her uniform, the manila envelope tucked neatly beneath her arm now. Without the apron she looked younger somehow. Less invisible. Ethan stood. Immediately as she approached the table. Naomi noticed the gesture but said nothing. "Thank you for waiting," she said calmly. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty restaurant. "I do not think I have ever done that before." Naomi gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Most powerful men do not." A soft silence settled between them. Somewhere in the corner, the pianist finished his final song of the night while servers stacked chairs quietly near the bar. Ethan gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Please." Naomi hesitated for a second before sitting down carefully. The city lights behind her reflected softly against the rain-streaked glass, outlining her face in silver and gold. Ethan suddenly understood why her calm unsettled him so deeply. Naomi Brooks carried herself like someone who had already survived disappointment long before this night began. Ethan looked at the envelope resting against the table. "How much is in there?" Naomi rested her hands quietly in her lap. "Enough." Ethan nodded slowly. "Copies. Originals." That answer landed like a weight against his chest. Ethan looked down at the polished walnut table for a long moment before speaking again. "Why did your father keep them?" Naomi's eyes softened slightly. Because he believed truth mattered. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Marcus Brooks really had believed that. Even inside rooms full of people who treated morality like a weakness. Naomi continued quietly. After the investigation, he kept saying eventually somebody would do the right thing. Ethan almost laughed at the sadness of that sentence. He chose the wrong industry for that kind of faith. Naomi studied him carefully. Maybe, she replied softly. Or maybe the wrong people kept reaching the top. The words cut deeper because Ethan knew she was right. He leaned back slowly in his chair, staring out across rainy Manhattan. You could destroy me with those documents. Naomi followed his gaze toward the city lights. That was never the goal. Ethan looked at her again. Then why come here tonight? Naomi took a slow breath before answering. Because tomorrow morning you stand in front of cameras and tell the world what kind of man you are. The restaurant had grown almost completely quiet now. Employees whispered softly while cleaning tables in the distance. Ice rattled faintly inside forgotten glasses behind the bar. Ethan looked at Naomi carefully. And you wanted to see if I was lying. Naomi held his gaze steadily. No, she said. I wanted to see if there was still enough conscience left in you to tell the truth before I had to force it into daylight. Ethan looked away immediately because no investor, no politician, no rival had spoken to him that honestly in years. Naomi reached for the envelope gently and slid it across the table toward him. Ethan frowned in confusion. What is this? Naomi's voice stayed calm. Your choice. Ethan stared at the envelope resting inches from his hands while thunder rolled softly beyond the windows above Manhattan. One decision. That was all it was now. One decision between protecting the empire he built or finally becoming the man Marcus Brooks once believed he could be. The press conference began at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning inside the glass headquarters of Callaway Capital overlooking Lower Manhattan. Reporters filled the front rows shoulder to shoulder beneath white studio lights while cameras flashed like lightning across the stage. Financial analysts whispered predictions into phones. Television producers adjusted headsets beside massive screens displaying the words Callaway Capital and Westbridge Financial announcement. Everything looked exactly the way Ethan Callaway had designed it to look for years. Controlled. Powerful. Untouchable. But this morning something felt different the second he stepped onto the stage. Ethan adjusted the dark navy suit he had worn like armor for most of his adult life and looked out across the crowded room. Investors sat confidently near the front. Journalists prepared headlines before he even spoke. Somewhere outside the building, New York traffic roared beneath gray skies still heavy from last night's rain. Ethan placed both hands against the podium slowly. For the first time in decades, he did not feel powerful standing there. He felt exposed. A moderator smiled brightly into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this historic morning for Callaway Capital. Applause rolled across the room. Ethan looked toward the teleprompter glowing beneath the stage lights. The prepared speech waited there perfectly polished. Growth. Leadership. Expansion. Integrity. The same words powerful men always used while carefully avoiding the truth. Then Ethan remembered Marcus Brooks sitting alone in that conference room 12 years earlier. Tired eyes. Shaking hands. One man begging to be believed. He remembered Naomi Brooks standing calmly inside Marlowe Prime while wealthy men spoke around her like she did not matter. And suddenly the speech in front of him felt unbearably small. Ethan reached down slowly and turned the teleprompter screen off. The room shifted immediately. Confused murmurs rippled through reporters. The moderator blinked nervously. Investors exchanged uncertain looks. Ethan took one slow breath. Then another. Before we discuss the merger, he said quietly, there is something else I need to say first. Silence spread quickly now. Real silence. The kind money could not buy back once lost. Ethan looked directly into the cameras. 12 years ago, a man named Marcus Brooks was blamed for financial misconduct inside one of my former companies. Several reporters immediately looked up from their notes. Ethan continued before fear could stop him. He was innocent. The room froze. Camera flashes exploded brighter now. Investors leaned forward in shock. Somewhere near the back, somebody whispered Ethan's name in disbelief. But Ethan kept going because after years of silence, truth once spoken developed its own momentum. I knew there were inconsistencies in the investigation, he admitted, voice tightening slightly. And instead of challenging them, I chose to protect the company, my career, and myself. The words tasted heavy leaving his mouth. Honest. Brutal. Necessary. Ethan looked down briefly before continuing again. Marcus Brooks lost everything because powerful people stayed silent when speaking mattered most. I was one of those people. No one moved now. No one even pretended to type. Wall Street executives who had spent years admiring Ethan Callaway suddenly stared at him like they were meeting him for the first time. Ethan took one final breath. Today I am reopening the case publicly, releasing all internal records connected to that investigation, and stepping down as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. Gasps broke across the room. Questions erupted instantly from reporters. Flashbulbs exploded like storms beneath the bright white lights. But Ethan barely heard any of it anymore. Because for the first time in years, the noise inside his own conscience had finally gone quiet. Nearly 30 blocks away, inside a small neighborhood diner in Brooklyn, Naomi Brooks stood beside a coffee machine watching the press conference replay silently on a mounted television above the counter. Customers stared at the screen in shock while reporters crowded around Ethan's stage like sharks around open water. Naomi simply watched quietly, one hand resting against the edge of the counter. No smile. No celebration. Just stillness. The older cook beside her shook his head slowly. That man just destroyed his whole empire. Naomi looked at the television a moment longer before answering softly. No, she said. He finally stopped destroying himself.